Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Sussman. I'm the director of the Center for Finance and Development, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center and the Graduate Institute to today's lecture and panel. So let me, without further ado, introduce Jean-Pierre Roth, who will introduce the speaker.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in this institute. This in two regards. First, because I'm a former student of the institute. I remember my PhD in 1976. So, well, long time ago. But my great pleasure, of course, is to introduce this new book by James Breiding, Too Small to Fail. I was used to talk about too big to fail, so I'm so happy to have this time to deal with too small to fail. James asked me to do this introduction probably because I had the privilege to be quoted in his first book, Swiss Made, the white red book, Swiss Made. He quoted me my answer to the question, Jean-Pierre, why is Switzerland so rich? And I responded in a very provocative way, well, James, because it's a poor country. And indeed, today, I realize I was wrong. Today, I should say, no, Switzerland is rich because it's small. Indeed, James' new book shows that small nations know how to defend themselves internationally. Their small size imposes on them exceptional qualities if they want to survive. Their small size forces them to develop skills which are key in international competition. Small nations must be agile, innovative. They have to manage their affairs seriously if they are not to fall under the domination of larger countries and see their prosperity decline. In a kind of paradox, the resistance to external shocks is greater than that of larger economies, which is not exactly common sense. They are much more resilient. And in this institute, which is the guardian of international law, I should add something. Small nations are not only economically successful, but they are also the most interested in a stable world economic order. Unfortunately, since the financial crisis, we are moving away from an ideal situation in this area. Large countries have progressively excluded small ones from global governance and imposed their views, or their absence of views, on the international relations. And for me, the creation of the G20 illustrates this drift. New global governance is now ensured by the largest economies, those which are the least interested in respecting common rules. The G20's inability to relaunch the Doha round clearly illustrates the current weakness of global governance. Another source of decline in global governance comes from the fact that many small countries are now a part of larger groups. And of course, in Europe, the larger group is the European Union. Larger groups where strategic decisions are often imposed by the largest member. In this regard, let me have a dream. I dream of a situation. As former central bank governor, I dream of a situation where the presidency of the European Central Bank will be held exclusively by governors of small countries of the Eurozone. This was the case 20 years ago with Wim Duesenberg. For sure, in my view, only representatives of small countries can seriously embody and defend the independence of the ECB vis-à-vis the governments of large member countries. All this, unfortunately, shows that the position of small countries on the international scene has weakened over the past 10 years. it is no good news for the respect of international law. Small countries, therefore, have every interest in building alliances among themselves in order to best resist the protectionist initiative or protectionist views of the largest country. They have a lot to contribute to international debate. The example of their success should be inspiring. Actually, they are the only real defenders of common rules. And this is convincingly highlighted by James Breiding in his book. After having read Too Small to Fail, I came to the conclusion that I should slightly amend my views about the success of the Swiss economy. It's not enough to be poor, you have to be small. Thank you.
Is this working? Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Thank you, Nathan. Delightful also to see Nicholas here again and some familiar faces. I thought what I would do is first talk about why I wrote the book, and then give you a little bit of an insight into some of the overarching thesis, a few examples, and then we're trying to create a movement out of the book, a bit what we did with Swiss Made, called the S8 movement, which I'll talk about. So we actually have two covers. One is a bit more institutional, and we have one which is based on the cartoon. We have Jeremy Banks, who's written cartoons. He does cartoons for the Financial Times, and he's one of the most reputed cartoonists in the world. And for a very small price, he gave us his cartoons for each chapter of the book. This was a Swiss-made book, which Jean-Pierre referred to. It's now available in 10 languages. John McCarthy here, who's actually responsible for our Arabic version. And we have a whole bunch of supporters, meanwhile, who have joined and made that possible. And the book's given by the Foreign Minister Ignacio Cassis, and basically is used by 70 Swiss embassies around the world as a cadeau diplomatique. I just start with a little film which sort of begins more or less when Switzerland was formed in 1291, and it just kind of shows you how fragile and ephemeral borders and boundaries are. And it's just 30 seconds, but it gives you a sense. It just gives you, because we have this sense that the world is very stable and very enduring. But the truth is that historically, it really hasn't been. You can see Switzerland in the green, and that's actually what's quite remarkable about it, how stable it's been during this entire period. It's the only country that actually managed to sort of be recognizable after 1,000 years. Anyway, so if you look at the situation today, it's not a great time to be a large country. You see, Merkel stepped down, her successor was ousted. Trump has been impeached. Very divided country. If you look at Macron and Abe, they have popularity rates which are less than 15%. Italy's government has been dissolved, and if you see the situation in Turkey, India, Argentina, etc. So it's a very difficult time, and as Jean-Pierre points out, these smaller successful countries are becoming, the bastion of democracy and capitalism, and really standing out as fantastic examples of how things can be done, and that was a little bit the reason for writing the book. The other thing is, if you look at the media, it's easy to become depressed. Just about every day, we're reminded about how much of a disaster the world is. But what occurred to me is that when I looked at these small countries, actually when I was doing the research of Swiss Made, these countries are actually, a lot of these countries are doing things right. So I thought it would be nice for a change to write something positive, to sort of talk about what's working. And that's actually what Steve Pinker says, is that there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but what's really important is what goes right. So if you're designing an iPhone, if you're Hawaii, you're probably looking at an iPhone. Or if you're designing a car, you might look at a Ferrari. So, you know, the nature of progress is to look at something that works and figure out whether you can replicate it. And this is really what the reason I wrote this book. So I chose countries that I thought were fantastic species and doing some wonderful things, and then tried to sort of understand why that was. So if you were to diagnose a country, let's say you were a doctor and the patient was a nation, you'd sort of do blood tests and EKGs and measure their pulse, and you'd look at sort of parameters and things like disposable income, to what extent can a country generate wealth, PISA scores for education, patent filings, happiness indices, trust in government, credit ratings of debt, government sovereign debt, et cetera. And this is what I did. I looked at all these metrics, and I kept seeing the same countries appearing over and over again. So if you look at the IMD Global Competitiveness Report last year, 9 of the 10 top countries had populations of less than 20 million people. 15 of the 20 United Nations Development Ranking, 11 of the 15 per capita income, and 10 of the top 10 were ranked in terms of, was completely uniformly countries that were less than 20 million people. And I don't want to bore you with details, but if best business to do business in, R&D is a percentage of GDP, upward social mobility. So if you look at the green colors, these are smaller nations, and the yellow colors are larger nations. So you can look at this in more detail. You can also buy the book, by the way. I'm offering it for 20 francs today instead of 30 francs because of the work of the Swiss National Bank has increased the franc relative to the dollar. to my expense, by the way. So we should have called the book Too Expensive to Fail. Anyway. Also, if you look at, I don't know how many people look at Monaco or Mercer, but where are the best places to live these days, which of course in a knowledge-based economy is incredibly important. And it's really the same thing. It's these smaller nations. If you take out Germany, it's uniformly small nations that constitute the most desirable places to live. I think a lot of you here in Geneva, probably for this reason. When we looked at Swiss Made, we had a chapter called Why Multinationals Love Switzerland. And really the most important element was that the spouses really like to live here. This seemed to be the most important determinant for people like Google, IBM, Dow, these sorts of people. And a bit the quintessence of the first overarching thesis is if you calculate the competitiveness of these, I call them S8 countries, they're about more than 2 times more competitive than the G20 countries. But they don't have a voice. And as a proxy for voice, we looked at the number of participants who go to the World Economic Forum. We look at the number of participants that go to IMF meetings, et cetera. So if you look at that, you see that these small countries, if you're from Finland at WEF, you may have 1 participant and his dog sitting in the very back of the room. So you have this very interesting arbitrage between very high degrees of achievement and very low degrees of voice. And if you look at over time, the trajectories are improving for these smaller countries, and they're deteriorating for these larger countries. So this is the percentage of participants at the World Economic Forum. You see it's very much dominated by the Anglo-Saxon countries, and very weak participation by these smaller countries. So the first chapter of the book is called The Fallacy of Scale. So if you look on the left and you were to, one of the key sort of rules of economics is the so-called benefits of scale, where the larger something gets, a company like Nestle is more profitable. Their per unit profitability for Nescafe or Nespresso goes up exponentially with the amount of production. So you would expect to see something like on the left, where the larger the country is, the larger disposable income it would have per capita. But when you actually do the analysis, you see that the correlation is actually almost negative. So it's more or less random. So being bigger is not better. And the other thing you see is that in the top left, you have this sort of clustering of very small successful countries that are actually disproportionately more productive in terms of generating wealth than larger countries. And that's what the book is about, these ones on the left. So certainly what's true is that bigger does not mean better. And we looked at other metrics, and it's the same conclusion. So if you look at Singapore, for example, they spend the least amount of money on education per capita, but they have the highest PISA scores in mathematics. So this idea that just more money, throwing more money at things, is the same thing with healthcare. You know, more is not better. It's more how you do something, and that's one of the main lessons you learn from the work that I did. So the other thing which is very important is that we talk every day. If you look at newspapers, it's always about GDP. You know, what's happening with the economy, how productive it is. But what really creates wealth is trade. So it's basically the people that have been in this gray zone, the difference between the trade and the domestic GDP. These are the nations that have succeeded. So if you look at Switzerland, for example, over half of its exports are in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. The private banking industry here in Geneva has been a fantastic exporter of businesses and services, et cetera. So what really creates wealth in a country is not Co-op and Migros, but companies like Novartis, Nestle, et cetera, who are actually able to export. And what's made it easier for being small, it used to be being small was quite a disadvantage, but the fact is the cost of distance has come down considerably. So whether you produce something in Shanghai or Neuchâtel or St. Louis doesn't really matter anymore because the actual cost of shipping it has gone down exponentially. And this doesn't include the internet, where the cost of distance is zero. So if you look at a company like Spotify, their most significant market share is in Chile, and they don't have one employee in Chile. They don't even have an office in Chile, but it's their most successful market. This is very different compared to 25 or 30 years ago. This just gives you I don't know if you can, anyway, this is, unfortunately it's not working, but this is a video that shows you the sort of, it takes one day and it just shows you ships that are sort of traveling. It looks quite nice, but I don't think it's going to work here. So the other thing that, you know, if you look at these studies like the competitiveness rankings at IMD or the World Economic Forum, I think they're missing, they're measuring the wrong thing for the future. So they have about 200 variables and they weight each variable, they give it a score, it all tallies up, and then they divide it by 200 to come up with a competitiveness number. But a lot of the things they're just not measuring. I mean, the things that I think are taking on increasingly importance. And one of those things is connectivity. You know, to what extent the country is connected. This could be in the Netherlands, for example, you have Schiphol, which is one of the best airports in the world. You have Rotterdam, which is one of the best ports in the world. You also see the broadband, to what extent the broadband is connected to the society. You also look at things like, you know, to what extent are peer-reviewed scientific papers co-authored by foreigners. It's also a sign of connectivity. And if you look at these countries, they score very high on connectivity. The other thing is trust, which is not measured, but the idea that these societies have a much higher degree of trust. And just think of yourself today. I mean, if you weren't sure this event were to happen, or if you thought you were going to be mugged if you came to the front door, or if they said it cost 20 francs and you had to pay 50 francs, all these elements sort of contribute to this notion of trust, which distrust is a question of friction, and these societies tend to be much higher trust societies. Modesty, I'll talk about this in a second, the marshmallow test. And then the last thing, which we have a chapter on, is to what extent it passes on the industrial treasure, so ownership, which nobody measures if you look at these reports. To what extent does how do people treat ownership? So if you look at, for example, in Denmark, most of the major companies are owned by foundations. So Novo Nordisk, Møller-Mærsk, Carlsberg, Lego. So they're owned in perpetuity. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's a very good thing if you want to pass on your industrial treasure from one generation to the next. Switzerland, the average age of a company here is 125 years old, compared to the S&P 500, which is 14 years old. And yes, it's all exciting, private equity and hedge funds, et cetera, but there's something to be said about a company like Nestle, which is able to go from one generation to the next, as opposed to have to recreate companies over and over again. So also connectivity is a question of exports. So if you look at the average exports as a percentage of GDP, Switzerland is about 65, 70% versus the US 12%, and China 20%. But here, this is the closest correlation between disposable income, GDP per capita, is actually trust. So if you look at the levels of trust, and again, it's these top countries on the upper right that you see, they score very high in terms of the levels of trust that they have. And I think we're seeing that, and we're here today, of course, and it's a great moment. Probably we'll talk about it a bit later. But I chose this is called The Night Watch, which is a very famous Dutch painting. It was actually made during the famous Dutch epic when they were really leading the world by Rembrandt. And it's basically a militia. Back then they didn't have any governments paid police forces or fire departments, so it was actually volunteers that had to sort of band together and put out fires or put out problems. And it actually depicts the moment when someone goes from being an individual to a group. We all have this duality where on the one hand we're driven by self-interest, which makes the world go round, but we also have a duty towards our community. And we're constantly sort of having to have trade-offs between me and we. And this is this moment when they actually a call to action to actually go sort out a problem. And I think we're facing that moment today as we speak with this crisis. And you'll see societies who are able to shift from this duality of me into we, and those are the ones that are very effective in dealing with this virus crisis. And those that are blaming each other and complaining about each other and not able to mobilize resources, et cetera. So these societies that we mentioned, they're actually much better able to sort of emphasize the element of community and the collective versus the individual, the collaborative versus the competitive. And this is an important factor going forward. I think modesty also helps. So I don't know if you met people from Denmark or Singapore, Swiss people, but if you hear sort of Trump speak versus Trudeau, or most people don't know who even the president of Switzerland is, but you can very quickly see that there's a big difference in terms of modesty, and we're living in a world where actually people want to do business with people they trust and like, and typically modest people are more likable and easier to work with than people who are arrogant. So again, this is not measured. You won't see the World Economic Forum publishing a degree of modesty in terms of which nations are modest and which ones aren't. But I think it's an important factor. Another important factor is what I call the marshmallow test. And again, it's not measured, but this is no different than a child. Does everyone know what the marshmallow test is, by the way? That's, this idea that, well, it's basically it's a very famous sociological experiment where they give children marshmallows, and they give them incentives to not eat the marshmallows. So if they actually defer the gratification, they get more marshmallows later, so the returns are huge. But most people, a lot of the children, eat the marshmallows because it's tempting. And so they actually see that after 25 years that they've studied to see that the children that are willing to postpone gratification are actually much more successful. So you have this also with nations. So Switzerland, for example, has a referendum where they voted to not decrease taxes. They voted to impose a referendum on the amount of debt that could be imposed by Parliament for future generations. I call these marshmallow tests, where a society is willing to defer something which is immediately beneficial in exchange for something which long-term could be very beneficial. And of course, the reciprocal of that is electing a politician who promises you lots of things and does that by increasing taxes. That's the opposite of the marshmallow test. And you see these type of things, whether it's debt, climate, pensions, inequality, these are all slow evolving problems that are, we're sort of wired if someone throws a spear at you, to duck. But if that spear takes 40 years to hit you in the head, you're probably less likely to move. And these societies have an ability to sort of deal with slow unfolding problems that are not urgent, but very important long term. This is the slide that shows you the average age of Swiss companies. So I just give you a couple of examples. So this is Singapore's healthcare system. It's actually this little red dot at the bottom. It's less than 4% of GDP. They have superior health outcomes, whether it's birth rates or longevities or remission rates in cancer. And they do that at about 1/4 of the cost of the American system and about 30% of the cost of the Swiss system. And if you want to know why, you have to get the book, but it describes how they're able to do that. This just goes to show you how important this is, because if you look at the cost of servicing someone who's 80 years old, it's about 15 times more expensive than someone who's 14 years old. So if you look at the cost increase that are programmed in the system because of demographics is just huge. I mean, it's a huge leverage factor going forward. And this is kind of a tsunami that's waiting for us. This was the referendum, the debt Schuldenbremsen, they say in German, but basically you see the black line here is Switzerland. They imposed it in 2000 when debt was about 60% of GDP. It's now about 40%, so it's a 50% decrease in debt. And if you look at places like Japan, it's gone up to 250%. The United States has nearly doubled during this time. So we've had a relatively massive escalation in public debt during the same time that Switzerland has actually curtailed its amount of, this is the marshmallow test, by the way. So this was, actually we just did our event in Copenhagen on Monday last week, but this shows you what they decided in Denmark, that it was, if you really wanted to change sort of habits, you had to get cars out of the cities, and they replaced them with bikes, because all of urban planning for the last 60 years was just a function of cars. So if you had more cars, you had wider roads, you had bigger buildings, you had more parking lots. So everything was revolved around the car. So they decided that to get away from that, what the key is really just to get cars out. So this is what they've done. And there's been just huge amount of benefits, but this is Copenhagen in 1970 versus today. And the benefits are enormous. You know, the people that show up for work is higher, they're fitter, obesity's gone down, pollution has gone down. I mean, it's just an amazing amount of positive things that just came from that one decision to remove cars and replace them with bicycles. Very simple policy, but incredibly effective policy. So these are streets. There's a place called Zwolle in Netherlands. They make these red streets are made out of recycled plastic bottles. So this is not a concept. They're actually done. They last longer. They're cheaper. They're environmentally friendly, and it's happening. It's not just a concept. So New Zealand just passed a law called naked produce. So you have a picture before and afterwards. So now if you buy produce in a supermarket in New Zealand, it can't be wrapped in plastic. So these are lots of examples of things that I think if you just sort of peek over the garden hedge, you can see in these small countries that they're innovative and they're coming up with solutions that are bothering all of us. So we just talk a little bit about the future. So I think, you know, the scary part is that I think we're facing a number of challenges which are serious individually and collectively is just mind-boggling. And if you just go through them, I mean, we really have an existential threat with regard to the planet. I mean, if you believe any of the science, it's a very serious problem, and there is no plan B. 100-year lives are not just a technical possibility, but a likelihood. And if you look at the key coefficient in terms of cost of social contracts. So age, you know, the number of active workers versus non-active workers, whether it's children or retirees, is the most important contributor to the cost of pensions and healthcare. So this is a big factor for all of us. Reproduction rates, women who are well-educated, I mean, the likelihood of a well-educated woman with a decent job having 2.1 children is very low. If you look at Korea, it's less than 0.5. You need 2.1 to have an equilibrium rate. In Korea, it's about 0.5. In Singapore, it's about 0.8. Japan is about 0.9. So, you know, these are societies which are facing over 2 or 3 generations the risk of extinction. So it's a very important factor, and you know we have to figure out a way to deal with it. You know, the vast majority of wealth will be inherited, so-called sort of lucky sperm notion. You know, we talk about information, you know, how we discover it, how we judge it, fake news, etc. Money doesn't cost anything; it doesn't yield anything. You know, what sort of impact does it have on a society? You know, does it still have its function as an indicator of risk allocation? So any one of these problems could be very, very serious individually, but collectively, you know, it's pretty scary. So we really have to have you know, get our act together. Anyway, this is the other sort of overarching thesis quite quickly is that in the past, there were scale advantages of being large. It was good to have natural resources. It was good to have big armies. It was good to have big tax bases. It was good to have big domestic markets. But at some point, you had some sort of resistance. Otherwise, you would have had just one world, the United Nations of the world. But you know, Great Britain had about 25% of the world's population in 1911, and that seems to have been the maximum point, even bigger than the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire. So there seems to be some sort of pushback with regard to heterogeneity costs or social cohesion costs. And so basically what I'm arguing is that the benefits of scale, so it's no longer an advantage having a big army or having lots of natural resources or even having a big domestic market. The idea can come from anywhere, the research can come from anywhere, the production can be made anywhere, the capital can come from anywhere, and the consumer can come from anywhere. It's a very different world than any period we've ever lived in. At the same time, I'm arguing that the cost of social cohesion are going up considerably. So if you had like a coffee grinder and you had to sort of figure out how much effort it required to produce 1 unit of social cohesion, I'm arguing that it's costing more and more energy kinetically to figure out a way to create this social cohesion. So you have declining advantages of scale, increasing cost of social cohesion. The basic thesis is that we probably will have societies which will consist of smaller, more adaptive, more social, cohesive nations. So, you know, that's the basic argument that I'm making in the book. I mean, I don't need to show you examples, but, you know, hardly a day goes by where you're not reminded of the sort of cohesion problems that people have. Gilets jaunes, for example, they come from a part of France which have been sort of suffered from the dislocations of industrialization. These are difficult problems to deal with. This is the average trust in the U.S. politicians has gone from 80% down to less than 20%. But you know, if you think about it, it's happened before. So the idea of actually downsizing and right-sizing, it's not really anything new. So you have the British Empire in 1911. I mean, it then went to the Commonwealth, and then it went to the Great Britain. And I mean, who's to say maybe Ireland unites and England goes back to what it was, you know, 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Denmark used to have all this territory, and it's now just the orange part, the peninsula right there. So anyway, we're putting together an event actually in Zurich, 1st and 2nd of October. We're inviting, you know, 10 people, the most influential people from these small countries, and they're going to sit together for a few days. And the basic thought experiment is you have the most competitive nations in the world, you have the most influential people from those nations. They actually happen to be the most collaborative nations because you can't bully people around from these countries, and we sort of sit together and talk very openly and honestly about these problems that we pointed out before. And it's not meant to be a utopia, but it's meant to be a laboratory. And we're putting that together now. So we have the delegations which have come together, and it looks like it's going to happen. So we have, for example, the Netherlands. Any Dutch people here? Or? Yeah, okay. How about Scandinavians? Any people from Scandinavia? Yeah. So you probably, if you're Dutch, you probably recognize some of these names. Feike Sesma is the chairman of DSM. Tom de Swan, probably know him also from Switzerland. He was the chairman of Zurich Insurance. Paul Pullman. This is more or less Dutch knighthood, and they're coming to the event. And we have that for each country now that we've put together. So why do it? Well, I think one of the benefits is that, as I've tried to point out in the lecture, that there are a lot of really interesting, successful examples that we can learn from each other. So the idea about sort of peeking over the garden hedge, there's some value in that. I think the world also needs people who lead by example and show results and not just pontificate or get up and talk about something, but like the case of New Zealand or the case of the plastic streets. And then, the truth is all these problems we're dealing with are shared, so they're not going to be, the Swiss are not going to solve it alone, the Americans are not going to solve it alone. So we have to really come together and solve these problems together if we want to sort it out. And I think the world needs a bit of more multilateralism, particularly in a time when people are trying to recede. And I think there's also maybe a little gap where the smaller countries can take a bit more leadership. I remember I met Fritz Leutwiler, and I was always so impressed of, maybe just to borrow from the central banks, just how disproportional power the Swiss had with central banks. So in terms of total currencies, I'm guessing it's just a fraction of the world's total currencies, but in terms of a voice, the Swiss national banks have always had a very powerful voice, very influential voice. And I think on other matters that could also be the case. So it's to some extent an effort to try to close this arbitrage between achievement and voice, because we should be listening to the people who've arrived at the future first. What's that?
Well, I think the voice of Switzerland is strong in monetary affairs, not because Switzerland is small, but because the Swiss franc is big.
Yeah. But as a total percentage of, okay. Yeah. So, well, we just had the launch event in Amsterdam, then we had the one in Denmark as well. We have a bunch of events planned coming forward, leading up to this. So that's it. I don't know how that goes forward. What's the program? So over to you, Nicholas, or?
Yeah, let me. Good afternoon to all of you. I think we are now supposed to move into a panel session, and I'd like to invite Jean-Pierre to come back, Cédric, Tille as well, professor. I would start by taking note of the fact that the Graduate Institute is very clearly taking risks. As Jean-Pierre noted before we started, the chairs are not 1 meter apart. So we very clearly are breaching the rules, but you're at least having your space. And I can stand if you agree. That leaves them a bit more space. What I would suggest to do is I'll ask them a few questions. And then get you involved as quickly as we possibly can. What I also have to tell you is, while preparing this, we've had some sort of a pre-negotiation with Professor Tille from the Graduate Institute. He told me Jean-Pierre Roth could have an opening remark, and I'd like to make some opening points as well. And I think it's only fair to give you the word as well for 5 minutes for just a few opening remarks as well, and then we can kick it off with the questions. Perhaps we do that, and then we start with the questions. But before that, a very preambular thought. You came up with this point about the marshmallow test. Have you ever heard about this? Have you seen this graph linking the number of kilograms of chocolate eaten per inhabitant and the number of Nobel Prize winners. Switzerland leads it, no surprise. And my take is we simply eat the chocolate after we work hard. So we reconcile it with the marshmallow test. Here we go. Cédric, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So, plus the chocolate beats the marshmallow in a matter of taste, I would argue. Okay. So let me start by making a few comments on the book. So I went through it, and being an economist, when I start seeing scatter plots like the one you had, well, I reach out to data and I run some regressions, déformation professionnelle. If I were to summarize what I learned by just toying around with that, is the key word in the book title or subtitle, more exactly, is some. I mean, why some small nations do well. Because what I did, so I went to the World Bank data, downloaded them, take some indicator of success, so I have GDP per capita, also use a Human Development Index from the UNDP, and then just regress on size. So just regression, is a coefficient statistically significant? The answer is no. You get nothing. If I had control for quality of governance, such as there's an index from the World Bank, a government effectiveness, rule of law, that come out super nicely. Okay. And then say, well, it may just be that small nations have better governance. So you regress size, population size on governance, you get nothing. In fact, if you get the scatter plot, what you have as at low governance, it goes all over the place. There's an amazing number of small countries that are messed up in the world. And at the very top, you get the too small to fail, small countries that do well. Okay. So that's the pattern. Then I say, well, but what about if I restrict the sample and I use the too small to fails and the G20? In fact, I use the too small to fail plus a few other ones like New Zealand. Then it works great. Population matters, even if you control for institution, and small countries have better institutions. However, it's not the proper exercise for a simple reason. If you compare G20 plus the too small to fail, G20 has only big countries, and you could do basically a square box where you have advanced, emerging, big, small. G20, you have the big one, advanced, emerging. Too small to fail, you have the small one, advanced. You're missing a cell. You're not looking at the small emerging countries. So either you do everyone, as it did, and the coefficient goes away, or you do only advanced, and the coefficient goes away. So what I take from this exercise is you shouldn't say small countries do better, but you do, and it's in the subtitle, some do better. So the caveat here is not thinking of size being an indicator. Then looking into... Yeah.
But bigger is not better.
Well, so you don't get an effect of population, fair enough. But you do get an effect of institutions, clearly. And what is striking when you look at institutions, if you want a country with excellent institution, you tend to get small one. Although, by these indicators, countries like Germany and Japan, they don't look so much worse than the countries, the tiny countries. So it's a matter, you have a lot of big countries that have good institution indicators.
Okay, so as I said, I think this point about economies of scale, I try to disprove that there are economies of scale, and I think clearly when you do the regression analysis, bigger doesn't mean better. I mean that's the second thing is I looked at successful countries. I didn't do an analysis and say here are all the countries, 195 countries, and let's just do regression. I picked the best countries. I cherry picked. Because I said to myself, let's pick success and understand success. And what actually I learned about these countries is that you shouldn't look at them in like regression analysis or checklists or spreadsheets. Each one is a species. Each nation is a product of its own traditions, its own competitive circumstances, its religion. Each one. So you have a country, you have Israel, which is a Jewish, has a Jewish religion. A very new country, 50 years old. Singapore, very new country, but it's a gateway to Asia. Ireland was the armpit of Europe for forever up until the last 30 years. Each one is a species, just like a crocodile is a species or a cockroach is a species. But it's still interesting to understand from an evolutionary point of view, why is a cockroach so successful? Why has it reproduced over the last 2 million years? That was a bit the framework that I had.
May I react to Cédric's point? May I react to first?
Yeah, because then I have...
You know,
And
I wanted
think-
to make
I
this
think-
lively, which is great.
I think the main message of the book is that being small is not a handicap. It can be a chance. That's the main message. It's not because you are small you are going to be successful. No, because if you are small, it's not a handicap. Because common view is that being large, you have all the advantages. Being small is not a handicap. That's the main message.
True, but so coming back to the point that you picked a successful country, which was actually my next set of comments, appreciate the introduction. I went through the book with example. I was left a bit with a sense of warning of cherry picking. Any country I take, I would find success story. It has to be. Even in France, so if we think of France as a basket case, it has a high employment rate of prime-age people. The French employment problem is among the young, not people beyond 30 years. And there's many dimensions where some of the countries are successful, but the other, in the too small to fail, are not. Take Singapore, it does great in health and education. Then you mentioned Israel, and there was a very nice article on Israel in the New York Times a few days ago, which was describing the horrible state of infrastructure and healthcare. So I was reading this and said, well, that's not a country where I want to be a commuter and having to go out to the hospital. So I think there's a lot of heterogeneity there. I totally take the point that one can learn from successful story. I'm not so sure that they predominantly come from a small country. I think you can have a broader... No, this haven't been harsh. There's one point I totally agree. And it is a sense of empowerment that small country can give. I think if we ask what is one of the key of Switzerland's success, and it goes toward the modesty, is decentralization of power. Okay, we get to vote all the time on big things, also on whether we should subsidize cows not to have their horns. But a lot of this vote is at the local level. That gives a sense of accountability and also a sense of power. You feel that as a citizen, you have an influence of what affects you, which is not the case in centralized countries like France. I think that's a big factor for the Gilets jaunes. So that, by all means. But that, and then finish by that, would suggest that to expand the analysis of countries that are big but federal, and they have an element of decentralization. Germany would be a case, and it does quite well. So in a sense, Germany is a small country by that metric. By the fact that it's decentralized.
Before James, I agree with him. I think something which is missing in the book, one parameter could be the distance between citizen and government. Here in Geneva, the most remote place in Canton Geneva, at the end of the canton, is only 15 kilometers away from the center of power, the local government. So the distance between citizen and government is important. Take France. In the middle of France and Paris, you feel lost there, and you have the Gilets jaunes.
So I point out in the book that if you look at the total population, the average number of citizens per member of Congress, for example, in a place like France is a factor 10 higher than in a place like Switzerland. If you look at the preface of the book, which is written by Rousseau, it's exactly your point. That's the government. Montesquieu said the same thing. The government is more closely felt, etc. So I do think, and I think you mentioned as well in terms of institutions, that it is a point. Actually, I think the German thesis is spot on, and it actually confirms. Germany is, for me, actually would be the response if a large country were to ask, what is the result of your findings? I would say, look at Germany. Become more decentralized, empower people more locally, etc. So I think there we agree.
But less obsessed with that.
But also the marshmallow test. I think the Germans, they do much better in the marshmallow test. But look, these are new observations, and I'm actually just not so sure regression analysis is very meaningful looking at nations. To be perfectly honest, I think we're too obsessed with size. But I do think that historically there were huge advantages in being big. I mean, there were really big advantages. Wars were a big deal. So if you had a big army, if you had a big navy, this was a big deal. If you had a bigger domestic market and nobody, and there was no sort of production supply chains that we have. That was a big deal to have a big domestic market. So I do think with the internet, et cetera, that the world is a very different world than when you started your trajectory of your data, for example. 30 years ago, I don't even think you can, those data points, how meaningful are they compared to a data point today with the internet, for example?
I think that the point which has been very clearly made is that agility is going to be a very strong currency in the future, whether we are sort of tall or small, or big or small. I think we've spoken a lot about size, and rightly so. And I would note in this context, and I think you hinted to that, James, in your presentation for a few seconds, the latest shock to the system came from something really quite small, 120 nanometers, the coronavirus. Beyond the obvious sanitary crisis we have to face, there is obviously a huge shock to the economy. These small countries, and I come back to your presentation, James, tend to be very open. You mentioned trade. Now, instead of having openness as an overreaching value, closedness starts to be something on the rise. How do you think these nations you picked up will face, and is there a lesson we have to relearn here?
So I think these countries also tend to have a much stronger social contract. I mean, if you look at what happens with unemployment, healthcare systems, etc., one of the findings is that these type of countries that we've studied, they tend to have a much more robust social contract. A lot of that had to do with the volatility of trade, because trade can be very volatile in terms of contribution to GDP. But if you look at the Scandinavian systems, Singapore has a fantastic system for free housing and very cheap, inexpensive healthcare, education, etc. So I think they're on balance probably more robust and better prepared, more resilient, as Jean-Pierre mentioned, to deal with these type of things. And I think the other point, this moment, this sort of Rembrandt moment, where you have to shift from selfishness to community, I think is a very important factor. And another factor I'd mention is that why I called the book Too Small to Fail was a sense of vulnerability. That these countries are more vulnerable. They feel more threatened. They feel they have to respond. They can't afford to feel entitled. That they have to react to situations. They have to be more agile in order to survive. So I think those characteristics are, by nature, beneficial to respond to crises.
Well, if I think of Switzerland being a kind of global platform, very, very deeply integrated in the world economy, depending on trade, depending not only on trade of goods, but also movement of people crossing the border every morning. So basically, a small country like that should be more at risk than a large country, because economically you are very much dependent on the world economy. Our production sector is dependent on people crossing the border every day. And this morning the question was in Ticino, in Tessin, whether the Italian workers will be allowed to come to Lugano or to Switzerland to work today because of the decision taken yesterday by the Italian government. So from that point of view, we should be more at risk. But the other aspect is social cohesion, and maybe that's very much dependent. It's not dependent on the size, but the way the country is working, discipline, cohesion, whether we follow the rules, we follow the advices coming from the government. This is the other part, and the quality of the health system. But basically, from the economic point of view, small country, well integrated, global platform should be more at risk than large countries.
I agree completely.
I can't resist, Jean-Pierre, to ask you a quick follow-up question. You spoke about the Swiss franc being big. Here we go, again, size. And I know you left the bank now.
No, but the point, I was making that point because when James was mentioning the role of the Swiss National Bank, small country in international discussion, don't forget that the balance sheet of the Swiss National Bank today is the fourth or the fifth in size in the world. So it's a big country from a monetary point of view. It's a small country geographically.
Was it the same with Leutwiler? Was it that big?
No, of course it was not an increase. That's the result of his influence at the Swiss National Bank, the explosion of the
You started
balance sheet.
Cédric, I know you're a very deep student on international trade. Can you speak a bit about the supply chains, how interconnected they are, how much of a risk this is, and how smaller countries might be better able to cope?
So any global supply shock like this will hit countries that depend on international trade more. I think there's no question. So Switzerland is quite exposed. This said, I think we're looking at a temporary shock. Now, temporary may last quite a few weeks, even months. But if you project beyond that, the lesson that may come out is to have more diversified global supply chains. So that may actually ultimately set the stage for a more robust international trading network. But there will be a pretty unpleasant moment of adjustment to get there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great.
May I just add something here?
Sure,
you know,
sure.
well, I was a former student here, so I talk a lot. Yeah. So just about supply chain, one question today is the watch industry in Switzerland. And the tendency over the last 20 years was to reintegrate production in Switzerland, to have a largest part as possible of the production of Swiss watch in Switzerland instead of being dependent from outside providers. So that's the reason why in the watch industry, at least the upper segment, where everything is made in Switzerland, is not very much affected by the crisis.
So
fantastic point.
So again, no disrespect intended with the regression, but if you look at supply chains, if you look at the architecture of capital formation, say 50 years ago, automobile industry, the basic rationale was we're France, we need an automobile industry, therefore we need coal, so we need coal plants, we need a steel industry. We also need rubber tires, etc. So we have these parts of France doing this part of France doing that, this part of France doing that. And it was the same thing in the UK. It was the same thing in Germany. It was the same thing in the US. There was this sort of, and basically there was very little trade, and there was this attitude that the architecture of industry had to be sort of a vertical channel. So and at that time, for example, when SARS occurred, China was a relatively insignificant part of the world economy. And now people are looking and doing regression analysis compared to SARS. But now China is 20% of the world economy. It's 50% of world growth. And meanwhile, supply chains are not vertically integrated. They're actually haphazard. They've just been selected and chosen based on who the most competitive offer was for a particular widget or a particular gadget. So I think it remains to be seen how disruptive this whole supply chain situation will be, because what I'm hearing is that there is quite a lot of disruption coming from China because there's one little piece or that little piece that can't be provided. Say, take an iPhone, for example. If you don't have all the parts, you can't produce it. And this is a very different situation compared to 20, 25 years ago. And so I think, I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but I think it will remind us that supply chains have changed and maybe this type of discussion that your point about how the Swiss watch industry, whether it makes more sense in the future to look after that more domestically, I guess that sort of conversation will come up more and more over the next 18 months.
Great. Very interesting. We've had watches and we've had China, and this provides me with the perfect transition to my next question. But first of all, I'd like to get back to what I've gone through in a previous life. I was a Swiss negotiator at the World Trade Organization, and one day I was sitting across the table with my Chinese counterparts, and we were not necessarily agreeing. We were, I think, even technically disagreeing, and at a certain stage, my counterpart told me, well, you have the watches, but we have time. And I have to say, that left me speechless for at least a few seconds. It was a really good one. I remember it all of those years later. But this really leads me to this question. Are we really having so much more time? And I think the crisis we are facing now with the coronavirus shows us, how much of a time pressure we do have. But generally, technology is evolving so quickly. We are in the age of the exponential development of technology. And change will not only continue, but accelerate most likely. And that very clearly also expands our vulnerability. Whether we call it shocks or black swans or just surprises, these things are becoming more frequent. Jean-Pierre, you want to get in.
Indeed, because
how are the small countries going to react to that?
My reaction is that you have to realize Switzerland is a small country, but the Swiss economy is made of world champions. Switzerland is small, but Novartis is big, Roche is big, UBS is big, Credit Suisse is big. So these are, of course, they have the size to react to the challenges you mentioned. Of course, behind that, there is a lot of PMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. But we have world champions, not only Federer, but we are also in the economic, in our economy, we are really world champion in watch, in insurance, in banking, in pharma, in chemistry. And this is important because they have the capacity for research, for development, for meeting the challenges you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So you can be a champion and large, but you can also essentially gain comparative advantage by being small. Cédric?
Mm-hmm. We are just gaining on both sides.
Great.
So we have champions, at least two of them, UBS and Credit Suisse. I wish they were not that big, but that's another story, although they came down in size. That's not too small to fail, but never mind. So I think the key here is to have a cluster of education. So if let's start from a starting point that change happens faster, you meet education, and I think here the next things to emphasize is not necessarily education of young people, but continuous education. Switzerland's done well, company, but my sense is there is a need here for an improvement there, because the challenge, the Swiss economy is doing well, but there are pockets where there's serious improvement needed. One of them is the fact that if people above the age of 50 years old lose their job, the likelihood to go in a long-term unemployment is way higher than for others. And part of this is an issue of retraining. So there's an effort to be there to ensure continuous through-life training, and especially in the later element. I think the Swiss can perfectly do it. I totally agree that being small and vulnerable gives you a sense that you cannot afford just to talk and let things go by. You have to shape up. And I'm relatively optimistic, but there will be adjustment needed.
James, we spoke about the necessity for continuous education and apprenticeships, even when the two of us were in Wales, in Cardiff, promoting Swiss Made in 2013. At the time I was at the Swiss Embassy to the UK. You would certainly agree to that. Education is absolutely key. And all those nations do share something here.
So I completely agree, and that, of course, is one of the fantastic advantages of Switzerland is the educational system. I think it's 70% of college graduates graduate from one of the top 200 universities in the world, and of course we're the whole system of apprenticeships, which is unique to a very select number of countries, etc. But I think you have sort of human capital, which is education, but you have social capital, which is this idea of collaborating and being willing to collaborate and collaborating with people across different cultures, and I think that this idea of connectivity. So if you look, for example, at patent filings, about 80% of patent filings now are not primary patent filings. They're combined patent filings. They're IT together with medicine. And I think the Swiss, really where they've excelled is, I don't think the education is really sort of brilliantly better than other places, but I think where they've really been good is sort of combining these sort of cross-disciplinary things within disciplines, but also across different countries. I think they're number 3 in terms of peer-reviewed papers that are co-authored by foreign authors, et cetera. So, and I think that's because if you look at innovation, it's the science-driven innovation which is important. And so, what's happening with the EPFL, with ETH, and if you look at the Nobel Prize winners, they're actually coming from smaller universities. So, University of Geneva won last year, the University of Lausanne won, and that's just the last point I'd reach is that it's very good to have the competitiveness in Switzerland in terms of universities, but also in terms of industries. So, Geneva has its banks and watches, and Solothurn has its medical products, and Lucerne has its lifts, and these people don't even know what's happening in Geneva or vice versa. They don't really care, but they have all these. It's like one of these British naval ships where you can shoot a missile. And yeah, you might catch tourism, you might catch watches, but you have the other 12, sort of parts of the ship which continue to float. And I think that's something that's very unique to the Swiss sort of architecture of economic development.
May I just add two points. First point on top university, I agree, this is really of key importance. But the advantage of Switzerland is that the top university is only 50 kilometers away from here. This country is so small. I remember visiting many companies in my previous capacity. Very important was the personal link they had with Zurich or with Lausanne, with EPFL, of the Polytechnical Institute in Zurich. And they were close to them because they were living in the same region. And no surprise that this part of Switzerland has become a bioscience cluster. Everyone is in connection with EPFL in Lausanne. This is an advantage being small. You are not very far from the research centers. The second point, top university is of course of importance, but the average education of the population is as important as the top universities. And we have of course developed that over the last 20 years in a very efficient way, developing the apprenticeship system with the different channels for education, giving everyone the possibility to start working, and then if they have the capacity, then to go to university at the end. But they are not all challenged into a baccalaureate, and they don't know what to do after baccalaureate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Coronavirus is obviously very much at the front of every newspaper at the moment, and we the state also deal with it. It really has changed our schedules completely, very logically, very understandably, but I think there is a bigger elephant, and again, we come back to size. There is a bigger elephant in the room. The environmental crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis is so much more big, and we absolutely need to tackle it differently. Here again, we need exponential thinking and acting to get into a different trajectory. May I remind you here that per person I think pump about 14 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere per person per day. Oceans at the moment are capturing, because it's essentially more and more of the solar power remains within the atmosphere. Oceans do capture, according to Bill Gross, they capture about 3 times the energy of Hiroshima each and every second. So that's the size of the problem. Small nations might be very good at putting together great policies, and I think I like the plastic roads and the recycling and everything. I drive around in my with my foldable bike, so I'm a fan. But then again, I mean, this is a global problem. Global solutions need to be found. How can Switzerland, but most importantly, those small countries you've highlighted in your book really make a difference? Who wants to start? Cédric?
So it's an argument that we often hear that, well, we're so small, how could we matter? Okay, but which in a way would tell us, well, that's not true. But we had this exchange this morning, and the parallel I made is, well, since of the middle 19th centuries, war among states are common. They're a butchery. And then comes this totally crazy guy from Geneva and says, we're going to set some rules of how to do this more humanly. It's a small country. What does he know? And it's a country that haven't fought a major war in the world. Well, we have the Red Cross. This idea worked, even though it came from a tiny country. I think the advantage of small countries is they don't have any hidden agenda. So they're the fair referee, so to speak, in the debate. And they're also wealthy, and as being wealthy, if you don't lead by example, the other guys say, yeah, you're small, but look, if someone could do an effort, it's you. You're wealthy and you don't want to do it, so who are you to lecture us? So I don't think that size should be a reason to say, no, it's out of our hand. There is value to leading by example, and you see the fair. And this is, I mean, we often talk about that. I have a very different view on whether public debt is a threat or not. But compared to climate change, we just nowhere near the same ballpark. That is a real threat.
Jean-Pierre, you spoke about governance in the beginning and the G20 and the failure to relaunch the Doha round. The question really is, do we still need governance the classical way, or do we need governance 2.0? Is that something which we sort of could advance here in Geneva?
To be frank, I don't know what to say. Well, my point was only that, well, we have these developments since the financial crisis where the big countries have taken the control of everything. Mm-hmm. And I remember very well 2008, the OECD, which was, of course, representing many countries, but the agenda of the OECD was determined by the G20. The agenda of the IMS was determined by the G20, and the small nations, also part of the institution, has almost nothing to say. And that was my point. But whether the governance should be the different kind, this is a good question for this institute.
So, I mean, I agree with Cédric that actually, I think these smaller countries do a disproportionate amount of good for these areas. So I wrote a biography on Luke Hoffman, who founded the World Wildlife Fund, and I'm seeing his son today about this whole S8 initiative. And if you look at the World Wildlife Fund, it's probably the most, I think Luke Hoffman was sort of the Nelson Mandela of the environmental movement. I mean, what they've achieved in terms of building this institution and raising awareness of the importance of the environment. We just had our event in Denmark, and you saw with his bicycles, but not just bicycles, but they've, when the oil crisis hit in the 80s, Denmark made a huge wager. It was basically a two-pronged wager. First of all, they did wildcat strikes of oil in the North Sea because they're completely dependent on oil. They imported everything, and they invested in wind, which today looks like fantastic, obvious, trivial. But back then, the actual economics of producing wind as a competitive alternative to oil, fossil fuels, was ridiculous. And they invested a tremendous amount of money, and now they're well on their way to becoming CO2 neutral compared to any other society because they've made that wager, they made that commitment. So here you have an example with Denmark, here you have the World Wildlife Fund. I see that in our delegations we have Paul Polman, we have Feike Sesma, we have Andre Hoffman, we have Jim Snob, who's the chairman of AP Møller-Mærsk, which is a huge problem in terms of shipping. But these people they're the highest ranking members on the United Nations SDG Committee for Environment. So where are they coming from? They're coming from exactly these small nations. It's not in your regression analysis, but they're there. And I think we can do that. I mean, that's the whole purpose of this initiative. Now, the elephant in the room, to borrow your expression, of course, is India and China, and the shipping, this offshore shipping and the airlines. That has to be sorted out, and probably it's going to be difficult to do that without someone like the U.S. saying to China, hey, and India, either you get your act together, or we have some sort of trade, penalty of some sort. But look, this problem is becoming, I see that just in the last few years, is becoming much more sensitized than it was a few years ago. So I think the more we complain, the quicker something will happen.
The more we move forward in this discussion, the more I feel that James, in fact, has already planned for the next book, because he's holding back some elements. At the very beginning of the book, he cites Epictetus. If we want to improve, we must be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Epictetus also said something else 2,500 years ago. He said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. This is to listen twice as much as you speak. I think we spoke a lot. I think we now need to listen to the questions. Who would like to start? Sir.
Hi, my name's Robert O'Riordan, Chartered Accountant. One thing I'd like to say about Switzerland is, according to the official statistics, there are approximately 1 million poor people in Switzerland. But I'd like to ask the panel about the role of Britain. You've thought that it could become a small nation now if Ireland becomes reunified and it's lost its empire. As a result of Brexit, do you think it will move from out of the European Union sphere of influence as a relatively important member to become a very unimportant member of the United States?
Yeah, so I was actually not trying to make a judgment, but just looking at the analysis of Great Britain in 1911, consisting of 25% of the world's population at its epic, and going to the Commonwealth and then to the the United Kingdom, and now, I think it probably, in my personal view, I think it's just a matter of time that probably it will downsize even further. Because if you look at the sheer sort of economics of Scotland, actually Wales is probably okay, but Ireland, I mean, they're incredibly expensive to maintain those relationships. And I think, frankly, the people in Northern Ireland see the sort of cost benefits of working with Ireland. I think it will become apparent because they're a member of the European Union. So I think being a member of the European Union, or being connected to the European Union, is a substantial advantage in a place like Europe. I think one of the big mistakes that Switzerland made in the 1990s was not to go the route of Liechtenstein, which would have represented sort of this extended entry into the Union while still managing to control the population, etc. And I think if you look at the lapse of industry, which has not come to Switzerland because of that. So if you look at the most valuable companies in the world now, it's LinkedIn's and Facebook's and PayPal's, etc. The Swiss American Chamber of Commerce had everyone coming from America up until 1990. So it was DuPont's and Dow's and IBM's, etc. So there's a noticeable absence of those companies that probably would have chosen to come here. Ireland has 300 pharmaceutical companies that probably would have chosen Basel as a place to come. It would have made a lot more sense. So I do think being more connected is better than being less connected, and therefore having some clear arrangement with the European Union where a foreign company says, I'd love to do business in Switzerland because it gives me as with Dublin, an entree into this big market. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I do think that Ireland has an advantage compared to England, all things being equal.
Cédric.
Just maybe a follow-up thoughts on the specific of Ireland is to take this with a grain of salt. Irish GDP looks great, but it's not very meaningful, to put it politely, for a simple reason. A lot of the multinationals having shop in Ireland, it's actually an accounting entry. And what it generates is a lot of profit, which is done by an Irish resident entity, the headquarter, but it's not a true economic activity. If you look at gross national product, not domestic, you get a very different picture. And Ireland is a kind of the most salient cases of that, and in macro statistic, talk to the Irish, they say, don't look at the GDP, look at the GNP, and then things don't look that great.
Well, just this shows that small Switzerland is stronger than small Ireland, because the champions I was mentioning before were born here. This is Nestlé was born here, UBS was born here, Credit was born here, Schindler was born here, and expanded all over the world. It didn't come over for fiscal or other reasons.
Your question reminded me of a remark somebody made to me before I left London in 2017. I was at the embassy, and he told me, or she told me, better said, I hope we are not moving from Great Britain to small England. So once again, size seems to have some element. Other questions? Remarks? Yes, sir.
Since we have an ex-person of the central bank and the IMF, I would like to know, are interest rates, zero interest rates worldwide, here to stay? And what does that mean in terms of alternative investment allocations over time?
Thank you so much.
Well, you probably realize that I get my pension from the Swiss National Bank. So I'm not going to put it at risk. So I'm not going to make any comment on monetary issues.
And I don't think Cédric can do it either.
Not on the Swiss case. So even though I'm not to blame for the interest rate, I only look over the guys who did it, who do it. But that's fine. But one point I'd like to make more generally: we often talk about this issue of low interest rate. With central banks did it. It's not really the case. One of the most striking aspects of international macro over the last couple of years is how the real interest rate on long securities have come down. This has nothing to do with monetary policy. There's a lot of structural factor, high savings propensity, population aging, etc. And all of these are slow-moving factors. So from this analysis, it tells you, well, low returns, especially on safe assets, are here to stay. Which, by the way, means it's a horrible time to pay back the public debt. If anything, you should do the opposite.
Actually, I completely agree with Cédric, by the way. I think it would be a fantastic opportunity. I mean, we've seen that in the Netherlands. They've now issued a 40-year bond with more or less zero interest, which they're using for fiscal purposes. And I'm Urs Wittliesbach, who's one of the founders of Partners Group, where we're actually trying to sort of promote that type of thing. But as you know, we have these sort of limits on public debt. And unless you have the counterparty to secure the AAA rating, which gives you the negative interest rate, but it would be a fantastic opportunity right now for Switzerland to issue a long-term debt, as Oxford University has done, by the way, as well, at a negative interest rate, and to have a stream of income for 40 years. And as long as you invest that money, where you could at least recover the capital and just buy a basket of 250 Swiss companies with an average dividend of 3%, you have a 4% yield, which you could then use to reduce the cost of your pension fund and everybody else's pension fund. I think it would be absolutely brilliant, and I'm advocating that. So we seem to agree on something.
Yeah.
Just quick follow-up, at the risk of blowing my own trumpet a little bit. I've actually a working paper at the HEID working paper series back in October, which is exactly on that, on the sovereign wealth funds, not with the Swiss National Bank, and there's no regressions in it.
So a call has been made here. There is a gentleman here who would like to intervene.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Andrew Crosby, fellow at Asian Trade Center, based here in Geneva. Asian Trade Center's in Singapore. I just wanted to come back briefly to the question that you raised, Nicholas, the governance 2.0. What are the implications for policymakers in this discussion? What are the strategic implications? I mean, if these countries, all of our countries, but particularly these countries, are very trade exposed, and the system, the open system that we're seeing isn't working well. We know you're very innovative, actually, because we see Switzerland making deals. We see New Zealand making really innovative deals. Do we need a different approach to governance, or a changed up approach? What does it mean for multilateral, and then what does it mean for those who are more like us?
So I think, I think you have to distinguish between sort of the political spectrum and the economic spectrum. My personal view is that the genie's out of the bottle. That unless you can sort of get rid of the internet, this idea of sort of the idea coming from anywhere, product, customer, etc., all ubiquitous, that's here to stay. And I just don't. But this is a topic of discussion. I just don't think that there's going to be barriers from, maybe in specific instances. But you see how complicated it is, for example, with the Chinese dealings when you start trying to tinker with the system. So I do think, Ricardo is right that, resources will flow to their most competitive use, and that we will be living in a society where trade remains open, in my view, unless there's unless populations are willing to stomach the actual penalty and cost of closing those systems. Politically, it may be different, and I think you have to sort of separate those two things. But I think, frankly, these big countries, and I really think politically, they're having a very difficult time dealing with the increasing cost and tension of social cohesion, the increasing difficulty of intermediating political consensuses, and this is something that these small countries seem to be able to do, and so on the political side, I really do see advantages in terms of just sheer mathematics, being proximity and feeling represented and feeling that your vote matters, etc. I think it is a big deal, and I think that these other societies are really struggling. And anywhere around the world you look at that, Gilets jaunes, Brexit, etc., they're struggling with that type of thing. So,
anybody want to add? Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. We have a lady here. Brilliant. Wonderful.
Sorry. Yes, hello. I had a question, since you said in your presentation that small countries had no voice. I wondered how or on what scale they were reshaping the world.
So, yeah, I mentioned, for example, the Singaporean healthcare system, and I guess I'm thinking that if people read that and understand it, that at some point they might be able to extract and use, some of the merit of what's happening with that system. This idea, I mean, he's very pro-debt, but particularly if it doesn't cost anything, I agree. But if you can become the SMB for guaranteeing that. But I do think this, for example, this referendum where they set a limit on the amount of debt, and also made it, by the way, counter-cyclical, where if things go bad, they can increase the level of debt. I talk to people outside of these countries, and they've just never heard about these things before. I was actually astonished. No one's ever heard of this debt. How do you say it in French? The Schulden. Yeah. No. And it's a pretty. It's a pretty straightforward thing to say. Hey, I don't want to sort of burden the future generations too much, etc. Or this plastic wrapping with New Zealand. So I think every country I go to has these fantastic examples that are not that complicated. I mean, they're not like rocket science. They're not, and this is a huge benefit if we can. The problem with the media is that they're so geared, and there's so much incentive to bleed. You read it because it's bleeding type of thing, right? So that's the whole media is geared towards conveying information, which is very critical and very negative. But I think there are examples out there of these countries, and more it's coming from these smaller countries that respond to political pressures, and because they have to respond to political pressures, they have to do things. So I don't know, ask me in a couple of years, and we'll see whether that happens.
May I just
Sure.
react on this debt issue? We saw one picture was striking the debt to GDP ratio over the last 30 years. I don't remember in the book. And you take France and Switzerland, they had almost the same debt to GDP ratio at the end of last century. And then we see the debt to GDP ratio going down in Switzerland and increasing. At the beginning of when the outbreak of the financial crisis, I think it was 75% in France, and now it's 100%. And I remember Mr. Sarkozy saying, this is a crisis, it is a debt crisis. We are going now to stick to the golden rule of balancing budget. And now they have even a worse debt to the GDP ratio. The point, the advantage of a debt break like we have is that before making new debts, you have to think hard whether there are not alternative solutions. Because issuing debt is very easy, and it's even easier if interest rates are moving down to zero. So the advantage of debt break is you have to think twice. Do we have alternative solution, and instead of making more debt, that's always the easy way.
Cédric.
Disagree.
Yeah, but I'm going to have a discussion on the Swiss debt break at that point. But as we're on debt, if in your graph one country was missing, Ireland, and it would have looked very different. If you pick in 2007, Irish debt to GDP was very low. Everyone was singing their praise of how well they were doing. Well, never mind. They had to run to the ECB and the IMF. The Irish public debt exploded. Why? The banking sector blew up. And they were honest enough to book it very transparently, or other countries fudged around much more. This, by the way, would have happened in Switzerland if UBS had not managed to sail through to 2008 at some point.
Because the package was well thought.
Right. I think.
So I So I think this notion of debt, you could extend it further. So we talked about these 100-year lives. So if you look at healthcare, it's really not too different than a pension fund, sort of actuarially, mathematically. So 80% of your whole lifelong budget, you spend on healthcare your last 5 years. Okay, so in a way, it's no different. You should be saving your day. How old are you?
20.
Yeah, you should start saving now. Theoretically, and no, but that's what they do. Who's from Singapore or someone said different?
But
so hang on.
I have to interrupt you.
So Singapore, just so you know, Singapore has 2 social security accounts. You have a social security account where you pay. You have your own bank account. You work for a company. It's matched by the company. They have a second one for your health care. So that they treat it as a...
James, in this country, it's not necessary to tell people they have to save. They are forced to save. Because they have to finance the pension fund and the social security system as soon as they start working.
Yeah. Exactly. But what they do in Singapore is they save twice. They save for work pensions, and they save for a healthcare pension. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference. So they have 2 bank accounts. And most countries, like France, they don't save for either. It's basically pay as you go. So they're basically expecting that the creditworthiness of the country in 25 or 30 years' time will be there to do that. So these are little examples of how countries can do something that actually work and really make a lot of sense.
Whether we are in a big or small country, I think time is sort of moving forward. Cédric, you wanted to add a last word? And then we have to conclude.
Okay, so a quick follow-up on this. Savings makes sense if you get the returns on your saving. As we say for the Swiss second pillar, there are 3 contributors: the employees, employers, and financial market returns. Well, the third contributor is gone pretty much, at least if you look at risk-free savings rates. So the pay-as-you-go system, I wouldn't rule it out so fast. And my last word, I have to say, regressions are very useful tool. If you want to really establish, what works, they're very annoying because they require you to have a clear, testable hypothesis, and then you are subject to the data merciless verdict on it.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thanks to the panel. Thanks for the healthy discussion. As you've seen, we can agree to disagree here and have a great discussion. Thank you so much. You have been astonishingly courageous because you came out despite the the virus threats and all of these things, and you listened patiently to us for a bit more than an hour. I wish you a great afternoon, and thank you so much.